We finally have gotten to World War II, and one of the important things for us to understand about World War II, of course, is the causes, the major factors that led into this. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that these were the European causes. These were the actual causes that war broke out, not the reasons that the United States joined into World War II. We're going to talk about the United States involvement a little bit later on, but tonight we're just looking at those European causes. So we've got a spider chart here that shows you the major causes, and feel free to draw this in your notes or do some other kind of graphic organizer that shows that. We're going to start up here. The first one was Treaty of Versailles. Then we've got the rise of fascism. Then we've got Japanese expansion, economic depression, anti-communism, appeasement, militarism, nationalism, and then the rise of leaders like Hitler. We're going to look at Hitler in a completely different presentation because there's so much that we can talk about with him, and I know everybody typically has a lot of questions about Hitler. But these are the major European causes. So we're going to go through these causes bit by bit. First one being the Treaty of Versailles, which many historians consider to be the leading cause of World War II. So the Treaty of Versailles, of course, we know ended World War I. And at the end of World War I, the later leaders of the big nations, the winning nations, basically drafted this treaty. And the treaty was set aside to address issues like territories, like what to do with the individual territories, reparations, armament restrictions, war guilt, and then the League of Nations. The treaty punished Germany pretty strictly for its involvement and left Germany with a lot of really bitter feelings about how the decisions were made. Germany was essentially forced to accept all of the blame for the war, and they had to pay back millions in reparations. Italy was also kind of disappointed by the Treaty of Versailles because at one point France and Great Britain had told them that they were going to get some land. That land was never given to them, so Italy was disappointed, which is going to be why in the long term, Italy's going to fight against France and Great Britain. So the second thing that you see having to do with Italy was the rise of fascism. And fascism is a form of government. And in that government, the state or the government is glorified. There's only one leader and one party. All aspects of society are controlled by the government. No opposition or protests are tolerated, and propaganda and censorship are widely practiced. So a lot of those, you will notice, are very similar to the ideas that you find in a dictatorship. So Benito Mussolini was the leader in Italy who came to power in 1922, and he helped to form this idea of fascism. And he ended up siding with Hitler and the fascist powers, and the Axis powers, during World War II. So one of the things that we just wrapped up talking about was that depression, and specifically the depression within the United States. It's important to know that the depression did not just affect the United States, but it was a global depression. There were countries throughout the world that were really, really struggling with these economic hardships. So after World War I, all goes back to that First World War, a lot of European economies were very unstable. So the boom in the U.S. throughout the 1920s helped to sustain worldwide trade. So as long as trade was going well in the United States, it typically was going well in other countries as well. And the 1929 stock market crash and the resulting Great Depression really spread throughout the world. And that goes back to that idea that we talked about last week of a global economy, how the economy is going to be influenced by the ups and downs in various nations. As economies plummeted and unemployment rose, many people turned to powerful leaders, to influential leaders, and to governments who made promises that they would eventually work their way out of these problems. And that could be through military conquests, getting new territories, anything like that. So really, these nations that were going through this economic hardship were just looking for a way out. Then we go down to Japanese expansionism. In 1931, Japanese invaded Manchuria for raw materials. The same year, they began to attack China, with full-scale war eventually breaking out in 1937. And then in 1938, Japan and the Soviet Union are also going to go into some conflicts. So Japan was really trying to show its muscles during this time period as well. Anti-communism was another big thing, and it was a fear. There was a fear in Europe of the ideas of communism, because under communism, basically all means of production are controlled by the government. Property, media, and all other aspects of society are controlled in communism as well. So there really weren't a lot of individual freedoms under the ideas in communism. So in the 1930s, because of the Depression and because of that need to get out of, you know, the economic hardships, we're going to see a rise in these totalitarianism regimes. Most people are going to end up choosing the ideas of fascism over communism, but they're closely linked, more closely linked than a lot of people I think would realize. Hitler exploited people's fear of a communist takeover in Germany and then began to take rise of power in 1933. And we're going to look at Hitler's election and the important pieces of Hitler's election. But one of the things that he was able to capitalize on was this huge fear of communism. We've got appeasement down here. And appeasement is the act of giving in to an enemy's demands and hopes of avoiding further conflict. So just you've heard the word appeasement before. You're just appeasing a situation. You're just kind of giving up something that you feel strongly about. In 1938, Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland to Germany. He claimed that German population living there was being mistreated. The British and the French essentially agreed to Hitler's demands without consulting the Czechoslovakian leaders in the hopes that this would avoid war with Europe. So this is just going to be one example of appeasing Hitler. And we're going to talk about that some in class, all of these different things that Hitler wanted. And that the United States and these other world powers essentially said, just take it. If it avoids war, just take it. I've just got a little bullet down here about militarism because we've talked about militarism with World War I. And we know that militarism is the glorification of war, that need to kind of build stronger armies and show your nation's strengths. So militarism was still going on in the 1940s, especially in Germany, because one of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany couldn't have any weapons. Well, Germany wanted to show the rest of the world that they still had those weapons despite the Treaty of Versailles. Nationalism, and we've talked about nationalism on several different occasions, and we know that that is the belief of the superiority of one's own nation over all others. So you think your nation is superior to everybody else's. Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo from Japan all thought that their nations would be able to dominate everyone else in the years leading up to World War II. They wanted to show that, and one of the reasons that they wanted to show that was it all goes back to that militarism idea. And then finally, American isolationism. The failure of peace efforts such as the Calabrian Treaty during the 1920s caused many Americans to really kind of to think twice about being involved in other nations. The United States was in a major depression throughout the 30s, and it was mostly concerned with its own problems. How do we get ourselves out of this financial crisis? Conflict in Europe seemed different or distant to a lot of us, and the U.S. tried to remain neutral. Obviously, this policy is going to weaken the European democracies. So those countries that had depended on us in World War I were depending on us again during World War II and really, really needed the U.S. to jump into the battles, which we did not do until much later on. So make sure that you understand all of the causes of World War II for our class discussion tomorrow and for really our discussion for the remainder of the week. And y'all have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.